Hello, this is David Hicks. I'm your host for the I'm Excited podcast. Whether you are watching, whether you're listening, I greatly appreciate that you're here, and I hope that this can be a benefit to you. Today, our topic is going to be adultery. We're going to do a deep dive into how dangerous it is, and hopefully talk about some tips that will help to adultery-proof your marriage. And by adultery-proof, what you'll come to find out is that I mean minimize the likeliness that adultery will occur in your marriage. And so whether you're married now or will be in the future, hopefully this will be of help to you. Before we go any further though, I do want to, I'm not wearing it today, but I do want to show you my pray for Jay t-shirt. Please, for those of you who are been praying for Jackson Igo, 19-year-old with Crohn's disease, was in the hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio for over 9 months. And finally, by God's grace, has made it home, but he's terribly weak. He needs to be able to eat, hold down his food, and his body has to really gain nutrition and strength from it. It needs to be able to do physical therapy. It's just, he's got a long way to go. So any prayer you could say for him, his mother Elizabeth, his dad Josh, his sister Morgan would be greatly appreciated. All right, so adultery. How bad and how dangerous is it to be unfaithful to one's spouse? Well, here's some things to think about. In the old law, in Exodus chapter 20, God is giving Moses the 10 commandments. Actually, he's giving all of Israel, let me sit corrected here. He is giving all of Israel the 10 commandments. And one of the things that he lists, and one of the things he says, is you shall not commit adultery. There are other sexual sins that'll come up in just a minute here. None of those are listed in the 10 commandments. Again, they're listed elsewhere. But the only sexual sin that made it into the 10 commandments was adultery. Secondly, in Leviticus chapter 18, I should probably read this one even though I didn't mark it. God is listing many sexual sins that he doesn't want the Israelites to be committing. Many of them are incestual in nature. Homosexuality is mentioned, and I will again clarify here and now that in the Bible, homosexuality is not the state of being attracted to the same gender. Finding yourself physically attracted to, being physically tempted by someone of the same gender is not homosexuality. That's just temptation. It's just, something that tempts you, okay? Yeah, I'm, as we'll find out here today, I have been tempted to do things with other women that I should not do as a married man. But that in and of itself doesn't make me an adulterer. So again, in the Bible, homosexuality is the actual committing of sexual acts with people of the same gender. It's not being attracted to someone of the same gender. But yes, that's mentioned in this chapter. But the one I wanted to home in on is verse 20. Do not have intercourse with your neighbor's wife and defile yourself with her. Defile. You're making her unclean. You're making yourself unclean. Impure. Used as opposed to pure and new. And so again, he says, do not have intercourse with your neighbor's wife and defile yourself with her. And then down in verse 26, he says, but you must keep my decrees and my laws. The native born and the aliens living among you must not do any of these detestable things. Now, I say here, I put on the board abominations. Here the NIV uses the word detestable. It's the same concept. It's something you look at and it fills you with disgust and even hatred. It fills you with disgust and hatred. So he talks about the native born, the aliens living among you must not do any of these detestable things. For all all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled. And if you defile the land, it will vomit you out, as it vomited out the nations that were before you. Now God is referring to the land of Canaan that he was going to give the Israelite nation. Verse 29, everyone who does any of these detestable things. So in all the stuff he listed, including adultery, he includes it as being a detestable thing. Everyone, and so again, verse 29, everyone who does any of these detestable things, such persons must be cut off from their people. To top it all off, 2 chapters later, Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, in the law of Moses, adultery was, among many other things, something that carried the death penalty. The death penalty for both parties involved when one committed adultery. So obviously, it's extremely serious to God that one be faithful to one's spouse and not betray them by going and having sexual intercourse with other people. In one last thought here, along these lines, in Proverbs chapter 5, chapter 6, verse 20 through 35, chapter 7, basically, 2 whole chapters and a large chunk of a third, King Solomon warns about the dangers of adultery. We'll read just Proverbs chapter 5, but I encourage you, if you want to dive deeper into this, read that section in chapter 6, read that section in chapter 7. So this is King Solomon speaking, Proverbs chapter 5. My son, pay attention to my wisdom. Listen well to my words of insight, that you may maintain discretion, and your lips may preserve knowledge. For the lips of an adulteress drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil, but in the end she is bitter as gall, sharp as a double-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps lead straight to the grave. She gives no thought to the way of life. Her paths are crooked, but she knows it not. Now then, my sons, listen to me. Do not turn aside from what I say. Keep to a path far from her. Do not go near the door of her house, lest you give your best strength to others and your years to one who is cruel. Lest strangers feast on your wealth and your toil enrich another man's house. At the end of your life you will groan when your flesh and body are spent. You will say, how I hated discipline, how my heart spurned correction. So in other words, you'll be filled with all this regret because you went down the road of committing adultery. Verse 13, I would not obey my teachers or listen to my instructors. I have come to the brink of utter ruin in the midst of the whole assembly. Verse 15, drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. Should your springs overflow in the streets, your streams of water in the public squares? Let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers. In other words, it's almost like saying, hey, yeah, you can sleep with my wife, I don't care. No, that's not the way we should be. Verse 18, may your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth. A loving doe, a graceful deer, may her breast satisfy you always. May you ever be captivated by her love. Remember, one of the things that we learned in the series so far, this is part 5 if you're keeping score, is that in marriage, sex is encouraged. It is something not to be neglected. Verse 20, why be captivated, my son, by an adulteress? Why embrace the bosom of another man's wife? For a man's ways are in full view of the Lord, and he examines all his past. The evil deeds of a wicked man ensnare him. The cords of his sin hold him fast. He will die for lack of discipline, led astray by his own great folly. And again, this is just chapter 5. There's more in chapter 6. There's more in the whole chapter 7. Read it, and you'll see much more about this, about the dangers of adultery, and how foolish it is to listen to the enticing, seductive words of an adulteress or of an adulterer. So, that being the case, Committing adultery, leading to the grave, leading to one's death, physically, spiritually. What are we to do? How can we adultery-proof our marriage? Well, the first step, as you can see, for those of you who are watching the YouTube video, you'll see that I've written, never assume your marriage is adultery-proof. In other words, you can't adultery-proof your marriage. You can't go around thinking that, I would never betray my wife. I would never betray my husband. Because doing so simply leads to careless, lazy decisions. It will leave you vulnerable to Satan. You see this in sports all the time. Okay, what happens the week after a weak team beats a team that is stronger than them? They pull off the upset. They win the big victory. They done the impossible. The next week they face a much lesser opponent. And what almost always happens? They get beat. Because there's hardly any way to remove from their heart the arrogance, the overconfidence that comes with pulling off the big upset. And so you approach the next opponent like, no big deal. And then what happens? You fall. I've experienced this in life. Often, some of my weaker, more disastrous moments have come shortly after great victories. And so it always helps to have the mindset that my marriage is not adultery-proof. Remember Peter, the Apostle Peter. Peter wasn't just an apostle of Jesus, he was one of his best friends. Jesus chose 12 people to be his special messengers among all his followers. And among those 12, there were 3 that he did more with than any of those 12. Peter, James, and John. And the night Jesus was to be arrested, Jesus warned them. He said, you're going to betray me, all of you. And Peter vehemently denied that he would ever betray Jesus. But Jesus told him, before the rooster crows twice, you're going to deny me 3 times. And that is exactly what happens. Jesus gets arrested. Peter ends up being in the courtyard trying to watch the trial and trying to keep an ear out, an eye out for what's actually happening to Jesus. But as he does so, people confront him and say, hey, you're one of his followers too, aren't you? No, I don't know that man, Jesus. And he ends up cursing and swearing that he doesn't know Jesus because he's afraid that if they find out they follow Jesus, he's going to be crucified alongside him. Or he's afraid of what might happen if they find out he follows Jesus. And so 3 times he denies him. Then he hears the rooster crows and he goes out and he weeps bitterly. I have lived life long enough to know that anybody is capable of anything, and that includes me, David Hicks. We cannot mentally assume our marriages are adultery-proof. And so when we don't make that assumption, now what are we going to do? Well, that motivates us to take active steps, proactive steps to minimize the chances that adultery will happen. And so the next tip here is mentally train yourself to abhor adultery. Abhor means to regard with disgust and hatred. It's kind of like the detestable and abomination. All right, when I abhor something, it fills me with disgust. It fills me with hatred. Well, in Romans chapter 12, verse 9, it says to abhor evil. Now, by the way, this is a great tip regardless of whatever the evil is. But especially with the evils to which you are the most susceptible, I encourage you to do this. In today's video, it's adultery, but in whatever aspect of your life, the areas in which you're the weakest, mentally train yourself to abhor that sin even above, mentally train yourself to abhor evil in general, to detest, to hate evil in general, but especially those areas that you're most vulnerable to. And so when it comes to marriage, whether you feel like you're vulnerable to it or not, mentally train yourself to abhor adultery. Now, what does that look like? For me, it looks like this. When every morning I walk the dogs. I have one dog now. But as I'm walking the dog, I mentally prepare myself for the day. Again, that's a great thing to do regardless. I highly encourage it. Mentally prepare yourself to follow the Lord that day. Mentally prepare yourself for what temptations might come and how you might face them and how you might deal with them. All right, so yes, it's a fantastic way to improve your walk with Jesus, to mentally prepare yourself every day. And if there's something you're trying to improve on and get better at, remind yourself of that in the morning. But there are certain things that I mentally train myself to abhor. Adultery is one of them. And when I think of it, I don't think, oh yeah, today I'll abhor adultery. No, the way I think of it is, I will abhor adultery. I will not be the flirty man. I will run from the flirty man, woman, or whoever who comes after me. So I pour the emotion into that thought. And by doing that every morning, then what happens when that temptation comes? I am much more likely to feel that abhorrence, to feel that hatred, to feel that disgust, and say, no, I am not going to cross this line with you. Because here's the nasty secret of life, is the temptation of adultery can come at any given moment, not at any given moment, okay? But it can come out of nowhere. I have experienced this. All right, 2 stories. One time there was a spot on my back, went to a dermatologist, said you need to get it removed, scheduled to get it removed. And so the day I went to the doctor's office to get it removed, I walked into the door, and down the hall, behind a couple other doctors, was a lady doctor. And she looked at me as I walked in, and she gave this kind of smile. Almost like this, ooh, kind of smile. And, I didn't think much of it at the time, but lo and behold, of all people, she is the one that was sent to remove the spot from my back. And so we're in a room alone together, doors closed. She finishes doing what she needs to do. So I have my shirt off, that's about it. And then with kind of a flirty tone, she says, is there anything else I can do for you? And to my own shame, faithfulness to my wife was not in my mind at the time. And if I had not been the coward that I was in a good way, I've been a coward in a bad way. Anytime you're afraid to stand up for Jesus or do what's right, that's the bad cowardice. Revelation 21:8 condemns that. But there is a good cowardice when you're too afraid to try something that's evil. Well, unfortunately, in this case, I was the good coward. Because if anything had come out of my mouth at that time, it would not have involved me staying faithful to my wife, to my own shame. My heart wasn't prepared that day to face that temptation. But fortunately, I didn't say anything flirty. It ended there. She went out, and my life went on. My life went on. But it could have been an absolute disaster to my marriage. Another time I was working working at a medical coding office. And eventually this girl got hired, young girl, and she wore the sexiest clothes to work every day. It drove me nuts. It's like, can you just please put on something a little modest? But yes, she and I had to, mentally fight off having adulterous thoughts in my heart. when it came to being around her. I had to fight off the urge to flirt with her, and so eventually she told me, by the way, I'm going to be moving and give me my 2 weeks notice, and I was like, oh, thank you, Lord. But I was mentally preparing myself for something to, might happen the very last day that she was at work. And so I was just kind of mentally challenging myself for that a little bit. But lo and behold, the day before her last day at work, this had never happened before. Everyone in the office was gone, but me and her. Now, who do you think set that up? Thank you, Satan, for to give credit where credit is due. So I didn't, a flirty thought came to my mind that could have led to very bad places, but I knew not to say it. But I shared, and nothing happened. Didn't do anything flirty, but the temptation was there. Did not see it coming. And in your marriage, that will happen. That will happen. Temptation can come from nowhere. But if you mentally train yourself to abhor adultery, then when it comes, it will help you. It's not a guarantee, but it will help you to say, no, I will not do this. All right. So tip 1, never assume your marriage is adultery-proof. Tip 2, mentally train yourself to abhor adultery. Tip 3, stay away from porn, strip clubs, etc. Those things feed the dark side of your mind, the dark side of your spirit. They make the voice in your head that encourages you to do evil stronger. And it drowns out the voice that God has given us, our conscience, that encourages us to do what's right. In other words, it's harder to hear God's voice. It's easier to hear Satan's when you're looking at porn, when you're looking at strip clubs and things like that. Think of the story of David and Bathsheba. It's one of the most famous stories in all of Scripture because it's so Hollywood worthy, shall I say. King David, a man described as a man after God's own heart, is walking on the palace one day when almost all the men of the city are gone because there's a war going on and King David stayed behind. And so he sees one of his best soldiers' wives taking a bath on top of a roof. And so what happens from there? He calls her over, he sleeps with her, she gets pregnant, he tries to trick her husband into sleeping with his wife, and so he'd think he was a dad. The husband wouldn't do it at the time because there was this war going on. He had this policy, I'm not going to be at home sleeping with my wife when my fellow soldiers are out there risking their lives. And so he wouldn't do it. So David sends a message by the soldier, Uriah is his name, by Uriah's own hand. Uriah had no idea what the message was. Uriah hands it to his superior, and the superior reads the message, and it says, put Uriah at the front of the hottest battle so he can be struck down and die. And that's exactly what happened. So the man after God's own heart did all this evil, and what did it begin with? Basically a porn/strip show. Stay away from that. Please. Porn needs its own video. I'm not going to do that. Probably not. It's going to be later if I ever do one devoted strictly to that topic. But man, does it feed the dark side. Okay. Tip 4. Stay away from high-risk situations. And I'm talking about what by high risk, those situations where you're one-on-one with someone to whom you're attracted. Now, the story I just told you a few minutes ago, that I didn't have a choice. Life just happened, and all of a sudden we're there one-on-one. But sometimes we go out of our way. Jesus said, pray that, don't lead yourself. God, please don't lead me into temptation. Well, sometimes we lead ourselves into temptation. And we volunteer to jump into that one-on-one situation with that person that we're highly attracted to already, or highly likely we will be if we spend one-on-one time with them. How many cases of adultery have been started with a man and a woman having a prayer session together or a Bible study together? They weren't married to each other, they were married to other people, or at least one of them was. And then lo and behold, in seeking the Lord, they found adultery. Because they put themselves in an idiotic, high-risk situation. Don't volunteer to do that. Avoid situations that are high, where they can easily turn into adultery. So last tip, very easy here. Love your spouse. Okay? Love her. Value your spouse. Do things like work. I mentioned just some things off the top of my head. Work harder, and I'm not saying I'm a master at this, okay? I kind of work at this, but work harder at listening and trying to understand your spouse than speaking your own mind and telling them what you think. Of course, there are times you need to speak your mind and tell them what you think and be honest and open with them, of course. But work harder at understanding them and listening to them. James 1:19-20 says, therefore let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, slow to anger, in other words. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. So we need to be slow to speak, slow to getting angry with our spouse. Instead, work hard at listening and understanding them. And then the anger part especially is much less likely to happen. Another thing is spend time together. You neglect time together, your relationship is inevitably going to get weaker. It's like our relationship with God. If you're not spending time in prayer, you're not spending time seeking His Word or listening to His Word, your relationship is going to get weaker. If you don't have time, if you're not thinking about the Lord, your relationship inevitably is going to get weaker. So spend time together with your spouse. And then finally, another just sub point here, don't neglect the physical relationship of your spouse. 1 Corinthians 7, we've studied it previously. You neglect that physical relationship, you are opening the door for Satan to tempt you. Now, there are certain times in your marriage, and I will tell you right now, where sex is not going to be able to be a regular part of your marriage. There's illness, there's travel, there's injury, there's just somebody's just going through a really dark, depressing time. They're just not mentally capable of that right now. So, yeah, sex is going to come, it's going to go. If that's the foundation of your marriage, you're in trouble. The foundation needs to be love. The foundation needs to be love motivated by Jesus. But if sex is the foundation, no, it's not going to work. So I try to think of a way to make this a little more memorable, these points about adultery-proofing your marriage. And so what I came up with is adultery is your nemesis. A nemesis is someone who's constantly trying to bring about your downfall, your destruction. They are working to destroy you, and that's what adultery does. It destroys our marriages. It can destroy our children, hurts them deeply. It can destroy our relationship with God. So adultery is trying to bring about our downfall. So it is our nemesis. And so as you think of the letters in nemesis, N-E stands for never assume your marriage is adultery-proof. M-E stands for mentally train yourself to abhor adultery. I encourage you to do that every day in your marriage or even before you get married. Mentally train yourself to abhor adultery. The first S stands for stay away from porn, strip clubs, etc. The I stands for I will love my spouse. I love my spouse, I will love my spouse either way, but it emphasizes that you are going to love the one to whom you are married and not betray them. And then the final S stands for stay away from high-risk situations. Stay away from high-risk situations. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I hope this has been helpful. God bless you.